Hello, everybody. Mike Donahue here, and my brother's here along with me. What's your name?
My name's David Donahue. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We are the Donahue brothers, and we are doing a little podcast called Growing Up Boston because we both
Episode
grew up.
6. Woo woo.
You know, it's so funny because, like, we kind of mentioned this last week. Whenever you say you're from Boston, people think you're you're right from the city, but you could be from Weymouth, you could be from Rockton, you could be from
There's a large swath.
surrounding area.
Right.
What's that?
Right. I said there's a large swath.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I said, if people, where are you from? I said Weymouth, they'd be like, what? So I just say Boston because it's easier.
I say that. I'd give it like a 20-mile, perimeter.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can
If
safely.
you're from Worcester, you can't say Boston.
Nah,
you have to say Worcester.
Right.
And then they're going to go, what?
Yeah.
But whatever. So we've been having fun on this podcast. We've been talking about a lot of different things. And, it may sound, we've got some criticism that, it may sound like we're kind of being whiny or whatever about our family and that kind of thing. But, here's the thing. David actually is going to unpack today a little bit of our family history. And the reason we're doing that is not to, slam anybody or to expose anybody's, flaws or mess. But the bottom line is that there's a progression that happens, I think, in your life where when you're a little kid, you put your parents on a pedestal, right? You think everything they say and do is gold. And I remember with my dad, who at the time I was idolizing him, he was actually a drunk and actually, a very, didn't pay child support. There was a lot of different things that were going on
At
with him.
his worst, right?
Yeah, he was at his worst. And I thought he was God. Like I couldn't believe, being around him. He made me laugh because he was funny. He was very charismatic and all that kind of stuff. So I never saw any of that stuff. I just saw all the good stuff. And so, then you go through, you get older and you realize, wait a minute, that wasn't exactly the way it was. And so you take them off the pedestal. And what people tend to do, and I did this too, was put them in prison, right? You go, in your mind, right? You're like, that those people are awful. Can't believe they were that bad. I was duped, whatever. And then, as time goes by, you might even leave them in prison. A lot of people do that, right? They leave them in prison and they're like, well, that's what they deserve because they were bad people and they hurt me. And so put them in prison, right? I don't want to talk to them again. That's where they go. They're in that box now. And I think, maturity and if you get help and you get a healthy perspective, you realize, and this is where David comes in, I think, you realize, wait, they're human, right? I've heard it put it this way, where we idolize our parents, then we demonize them. And then at some point, if we're in a healthy situation, we end up humanizing them, right? And last week I said in the podcast, hurt people. That's our family, basically, is this long line of hurt that goes back to the Mayflower, which David's going to unpack a little bit here. And then it kind of followed us to, the 60s where we were born. And then, obviously, into current time. But that pause, hurt people, that pause is really important because that's where the health comes, right? That's where you take someone out of the prison and you humanize them and put them on, even ground. And I've heard it said this way too, that, we're all part of a genetic lottery. You get what you get, right? So you don't choose, and we didn't choose. David and I were born into, an alcoholic family and, all this mess that David's going to talk about, but, and here we are. So that's, that's really the progression. And I do want to speak back to the people who maybe have a criticism about talking about it. I don't think denial is dealing, right? Denial isn't dealing. Denial is delaying, right? So
right.
You got to talk about it, right?
We have a tendency to whitewash, right?
Right. So, David, last couple of years, you've been doing a lot of research on our family, and some of it's kind of comical, kind of where we come from. There's some crazy stuff that goes back to. So yeah, unpack that a little bit for us.
So it's crazy stuff. It's like, this can't be real. Okay.
It is.
Like, so Mike, I like what you said about the pause. So this ancestry stuff for me is actually it's diving into the pause between hurt people, hurt people. It's taking the sting out of some of the things, the way that I was treated by my father and my mom, and you know, not taking it so personally, understanding where they came from takes the individual, like they didn't target me. They didn't, this was not a premeditated thing. This is just what they were handed. And we talked about this before. Part of the history or the legacy in our family is this maternal link that's missing. So I'll start with my great grandmother and my paternal great grandmother, so dad's grandmother and grandparents. They died. I have their death certificates right here. They died within 1 year of each other, and one of them died of tuberculosis. The other one died of pneumonia, and they left 5 children with no, just alone. So my grandmother was orphaned, and she grew up in an orphanage in Boston. And she shows up on the census as an inmate. So she's 3 years old, 5 years old. And that's how they listed the people that were living in this particular orphanage as an inmate. So that's her start. So she went on to have, I think, 9 more children. She got divorced in 1932 and then had 4 children with the first marriage, and then had 5 more children out of wedlock, and the last one was my father. So there's that maternal link that's missing, right? So, and then on our maternal side, we had our great grandmother, who was actually the victim of a sexual assault while she was in an insane asylum in Grafton, Massachusetts. So and I say it's like, in our family, like, we're all crazy, but nobody's really insane. So it's like really hard to like pinpoint. The records are sealed. I don't know what her diagnosis was, but I can tell you that at Grafton State Hospital, they had a ward for excitable women. That is the name of the ward. So it could have been she was just overly flirtatious. She could have been a free thinker, and she could have been like a schizophrenic maniac. Yeah. We don't know. What we do know is that during that time, she was impregnated by a very prominent family member out there, and that resulted in my grandmother. So the reason why I'm saying this is that these are 2, on both my maternal and paternal side, 2 missing mothers, right? So actually 3 missing mothers. So my grandmother on my maternal side didn't have a mother. She grew up with an aunt who claimed to be her mother. And then on the other side, and I don't want to get too confusing, shouldn't need a spreadsheet for this stuff, but my paternal great grandmother was orphaned. So the missing links are there. So most people have this lineage where there's a mother and a father and consistency. In our family, that didn't happen. And as a result, my paternal grandmother had a wild life. She, like I said, she divorced. So first of all, divorce in 1932 was completely unheard of. Right. And then having 5 more children out of wedlock, and then giving all those children up was pretty severe. The other thing I want to talk about is that, she's been kind of slut shamed in our family because she got divorced. She had all these kids. But the flip side of that is that my father was born in 1936. That was smack in the middle of the Depression. So people were intact families were giving up their children anyway because they couldn't feed them back then. So there's always a historical context to all this as well. And an interesting thing about my paternal grandmother is that I found her in the 1926 issue of Vogue magazine. I'm sitting at the dentist's office going, I think I'll Google her again. And bam, she comes up, and she was photographed by a famous photographer who, is very well known for his innovative work in photography. And So you can go online right now and buy a picture of my paternal grandmother.
Wow, look at her. She is beautiful.
Right, right, right. Like, she was a model.
Wow.
She was a model right as photography took off. So most of, fashion magazines were all illustrations. And then photography started to be more prevalent. And she was like at the forefront. And it's not just, she's not like model number 3. They name her in the Vogue spread. So I've only got to see one picture from that spread. I'm sure there are others out there. The other fascinating thing about her is, that you can whitewash a lot of things, but you can't whitewash the public records, right? So border crossings don't lie, census don't lie. Family members try to hide from the truth, but these things that we have to look back at history with, these tools, they're unbiased. They don't have an agenda, so they're the most reliable. So my paternal grandmother, the same model, she kept coming up as I Googled her in a 1930s, I'm sorry, late 1920s famous murder trial. So Sacco and Vanzetti was a huge murder trial. They've written books about it. It was right around the time when these anarchists were, taking over, and World War One just ended. So there was a lot of sedition laws that were put into place. So as a result, there were anarchists. So we think we're living in this tumultuous public, political charged environment now. These things have been going on forever. So right around World War One, the president and Congress passed all these sedition laws. You couldn't talk about the United States. You couldn't badmouth the president. And so as a result, these anarchists popped up, and two of those anarchists were Sacco and Vanzetti, and they robbed a shoe factory in Whitman, Massachusetts. They robbed the payroll. There were no checks, back then. They just handed everybody cash. So these armored cars would pull up with all this with the payroll, and they, in the process, they shot one of the guards and killed him. And it was like, it was a federal trial because it had to do with the FDIC. So there was a death penalty involved in it. So it was a huge, huge case. One of the suspects in that case actually lived with my grandmother and her husband at the time in Wellesley, and they tried to give them an alibi. My grandmother and her husband at the time, Joe Donahue, lied to the police and said that this guy was, he was at the dentist and da 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 da. They went into this big long thing, and so this was a state police investigation. So the Wellesley police, where they lived, actually knew them, and they're like, no, you can't believe a word out of these people's mouths.
What was the exact? Wasn't the exact quote like, "Don't listen to an effing thing"? That
Something like that, right? It was, it was in 1930s, vernacular, like, shut up, we'll take you back with the rabbit hose, you mugs. So right, these kinds of things, and I love walking down this path, because it's fascinating. I mean, this, like I said, if you know anything about legalese, this case. I mean, it's just it's 600 pages. The case is 600 pages. It's like
wow.
it's like War and Peace, right? So, and our grandparents were involved in that. Our great grandparents were involved in that. Yeah. So,
I want
but
the money.
on the flip side of that, so my grandmother, on my maternal grandmother, grew up. Basically, she was. I'll say she was orphaned. She grew up with an aunt that took care of her, that we always called great grandmother. She wasn't our great grandmother. She was our great aunt, and I always knew that there was something missing there. Like, she had an apartment right around the corner from us. And when we were young, we would knock on our door. She'd be good for a quarter or a dime or whatever. And once in a while, she'd invite you in, and there were pictures of her family. So she had biological kids, and then nothing of my grandmother. This was a woman that, she was an imposter. She was supposed to be, my grandmother's mother, but she wasn't. It was like the typical Cinderella story kind of thing. And I noticed that estrangement right away. I mean, even at at like 7, 8 years old, I'm like, I don't know these. Who are these people on your wall? Because I don't know them.
Yeah.
It was an odd sensation, and so that's. I mean, if I was picking that up as a child, how must have my grandmother owned all that, right?
Right.
So not knowing, being treated differently, being treated poorly, and not knowing why. Not knowing that she thought that this woman was her mother all of her
Right.
life.
Right.
So right, yeah. Anyway, so I wanted to ask you, Mike. I mean, I know you're not as enthusiastic around this stuff. I love history. I'm a history buff, so I think this stuff is a lot of fun. Some of it, some of it not so much. But what do you think when I started digging up this stuff? How did you feel about it?
Well, I do appreciate it. I probably wouldn't do it myself just because I'm not wired that way. You're wired that way, which is good. You're a detail guy in some ways. You love that stuff and you dive in. For me, I really the way I'm fascinated every time you talk to me about it. I like hearing it because it does give me some context. That hurt people thing is really important with my work because what I do in schools, the first book I put out was called Reinventing My Normal. And that's what basically people have to do is when you have a normal like that, because when we were born, I was born in 1962, you were born in 65. We were born right smack dab in the middle of all this stuff, right? That never got resolved. Like
Right.
mom
Never even
came
got
out of,
talked about. Right.
right. And mom came out of an alcoholic situation because, you didn't talk much about her dad, but he's got a whole history too. We go back
Right.
into that. Maybe sometime we will, but
Right.
there's a lot of bad stuff there too. And so Alice, our mom, was born into these, crazy situations,
Right.
and we don't
So
want to get too
our
deep.
grandmother, I didn't mention. I mean, he's a whole chapter. My grandmother's husband, my grandfather, but I look at him as a symptom of the way she was raised. So she was raised. Nobody really loved her. They went. They were depression babies.
You're
They
talking about
bounced around.
grandma, our mom's mom.
Right, right.
Yeah,
So she married, and the there's no coincidence that she married probably a carbon copy of the people that raised her, belligerent, know it all, alcoholic, with some other stuff that goes with that. So those were my grandmother's parents. My mother's mother didn't feel like she deserved anything, and my mother's father was a misogynistic alcoholic who no other woman would have, kind of thing. Do you
right,
know what I mean? Um, and that's, our mother is the one who raised us. So
right,
in that sense, that's what I'm sort of getting at is like, I want to take the personal sting out of that. And some of the things that, my mother did or didn't do, were, not really her fault. And I can't really, so when you go this far back, you can't really find fault. So that whole aspect is missing now. The blame thing, because it just it goes way back to the Mayflower. Like we said, the first the first booze cruise was the Mayflower, and we were on it, right? So that's what I mean. Like that's the pause. That's where the pause is between hurt people. Like going into that pause, going in and taking an in-depth look around at what tools our mother had and our father really,
right.
um and what some of those missing pieces were. Now it's not like, well, my father didn't abandon me, he abandoned himself 20 years before that.
Exactly
Right,
right.
right. So
Exactly right. And I think that's important because it's that process when you take them off the pedestal, you put them in prison, and when you finally get to that point where you're taking them out of the prison, you put them back on level ground. That's what has to happen. You have to go, wait, this is something that I'm not excusing what she did,
no.
at all. I think there was a lot of really bad things that happened to all of us from
Right, right,
directly from her. But
right,
I remember one night, David, that I don't know if you remember this, but she didn't drink. Our mom didn't drink. Like she was an alcoholic, but she once in a while would have a beer or something. And I think she had like a beer and she got real like talky. And she started unpacking a little bit more of the history. And
Right.
I remember sitting there watching her face and seeing the pain, and she was almost like in a trance, like she was just
Yeah.
reliving what happened to her growing up. And it's almost like it elevated me up like 30 feet. And I could look down on it and go, oh, wait, there's a history here. Like hurt
Right.
people. It goes back to, her past and then even beyond that. And then if it landed here in, our laps. And so, yeah, I think that helps. And again, I forgive mom for the stuff that's happened, but
Yeah.
but I'm not reconciled with her in the sense that we're like now on the same page. We're still not on the same page because of that pause, because she's never paused. And in my opinion,
Right. No, she hasn't.
she's never really got the help that she should have got. And we talked about this last week, but I don't think the help was readily available to people like
So
her
any of
back
them,
in the 60s
any
and
of
stuff.
them.
Yeah.
Right.
They didn't talk about that stuff. They just swept it under the rug and had another drink.
Right.
And
Right.
now there's a lot more awareness to mental health and dealing with, some of these issues, which I'm grateful for because that's helped me a lot.
Yeah. So, I want to just circle back to our maternal great grandmother who was, sexually assaulted, and um, the family that so it would be my great grandfather, very prominent family of attorneys that are nationwide today. I mean, this is a household name in the legal world. So there's just a lot of like family stories that kind of pinpoint him. So there's no DNA or anything like that, but it's pretty well established that this guy is this guy was our great grandfather, and so I found on Ancestry a picture of his brother.
No, his son.
uh, oh, his son. Sorry, right. So our great grandfather's son, so he'd be our great uncle. So so it's one of his prep school pictures. I mean, these people were affluent. Um, and as soon as I hit the link, I'm like, oh my god, there's my brother. I mean,
It looked
I
just
almost
like
I
you.
almost threw my laptop across the floor. I'm like, no DNA paternity test needed here. Like, there's my brother. Like, just it, um,
Yeah, it
eh,
spooked me out. When you said that to me, I was like, holy, what the hell, Dad?
and at first you were like, oh sure, yeah, it kind of looks like. Then you're like,
Yeah, you'd called me and said, I found a picture that looks like you. I'm like, oh, whatever. Like, I was like, oh my, I showed my wife. She's like, is that you? Like, it was just nuts.
And you've been kind of a mystery because you don't really, there's not, you don't really look like anybody in Dad's family. A little bit in Mom's, but more so on that family side, and same thing with Karen. I never could pinpoint our sister Karen. She has she's very pretty, kind of a striking looks, and then I found that picture of my grandmother, my dad's mom, and who we never knew.
Little picture. Yeah, that looks a
Right,
lot like her.
like dead on. There's no,
Let's throw that
I
up
don't,
again.
I don't need to research this
Yeah, look at that. Wow.
anymore. Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so, right. I mean, and as I said, this kind of search has helped me understand my parents a little bit better. I've said this before that when I first started this, was able to find my dad's sister, his biological sister, and I never saw him so animated as when he met this woman that was his biological sister. He had no link to his past at all, and I'm sort of like, I'm a bulldog. I don't give up. Like, somebody gives me a clue, I'm gonna find it, right? So, um, and but when I did, I'm glad I was able to give that to him. Yeah, like I said, I saw this gleam, this animation nuance in his demeanor that I'd never ever seen before. He's always been really flatline, but there was like a spark there. I'm like, oh my god, my father's alive, like, really. Because he's always been like that monotone, don't show any emotion kind of guy. And when I found his sister, they hooked up and they were like, you know,
Instantly, right? Wasn't
like
it instant?
nothing ever got in their way. like
Wow.
they knew each other all of their lives. It was miraculous to see. I'm like, and I wanted information about my grandmother who had been dead for a while. And she wasn't having me. She didn't like me at all. I may have been like in your face, okay, like uh, not having the
Okay, Sherlock, you're like digging for clues,
right,
and
you're
she's
right,
like,
but
"I
not
just want to
having
have
the
her."
awareness, like this is her mother, and people called her a slut because she had 5 kids out of wedlock, right? Like this was 1920 to me. Like I don't care,
Right, right, right.
but there was that stigma that she didn't want to, expound
Unpack.
on. I
Yeah.
mean, I was able to look beyond, what a divorce meant. Like divorce
You
is
don't care. You
divorce,
just
right?
want information. Yeah.
Right, right, yeah, yeah. So,
She didn't.
um, yeah, so it's been, it's been an interesting ride. Like I said, there's still more to uncover. I'm actually going to be writing my maternal grandmother's story. I have most of it, a lot of it done already, but I want to get the facts right because this is, you these like I what we just talked about. This is dealing with people's lives, even though they've been dead for a long time. You got to get it right. You got to get the information right, and you can't just send something off with supposition. And I want to get as many facts as I can. And it's been this roller coaster up and down, trying to pinpoint my grandmother's um, paternal side. Just
Yeah.
my heart breaks for her because she she never had a core. She never had she was always at the whim of my grandfather and whatever he wanted to do, and some of that stuff was monstrous.
Yeah.
So again, we kind of put her in prison for going along with that kind of thing. But then when you unpack it a little bit more, you put her back in the pause, and
Yep.
without as much judgment. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things she should have done to protect my mother. She didn't, but she didn't have the wherewithal to do that. So,
Yeah.
right,
I remember her. She was sweet to us. I mean, she was always really kind. I have no bad memories of her.
right,
None.
right. Um,
Grandpa, I do, but
yeah,
I don't of her. She
she
was
was a
always.
stand by your man, 1940s, 50s
Yeah.
war bride, and yeah, I mean, and so on that note, somebody did love her. So I know there was a period in her life before she went to live with this great aunt, that she stayed with her grandparents in Quincy, and I think it was during that time that she got the love that she was able to show us. I think after that was a nightmare. When
Okay.
she went to live with Bessie Field, and again, this is the Depression, so people are bouncing around
You're
looking for
couch
work,
hopping.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, you always have to look at these things too in the context of what was going on at the time,
Right.
politically, whatever. So, right,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So just to wrap this up, I would say, I think it's really important what you've done, David. I mean, I've really appreciated all the, the hard work because it's hard work. I mean, digging, like you said, you're a bulldog and you go after it. So I really
You can go
appreciate
down a
that.
lot of rabbit holes,
Yeah. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right, right, yeah,
But
yeah.
one of the things I want to challenge our audience with is this: is you may be apprehensive about addressing some of these family history things because there's a lot of, like when you dig this stuff up, there's pain involved in it and people's lives and that kind of stuff. But one of the things I would say is what you don't address, you bless, right? So when you don't address something that's obvious, like I don't know, like an elephant in the room type of thing in your family, you're blessing it. You're giving it permission to exist.
Right.
And I think that's what you've done, David, really well is we're not trying to hurt anybody.
No,
We're trying to get back to the root of what happened so we can go, wait, how do we change us? How do we
right,
I need to address I'm not trying to address it in my great grandpa, they're all dead, right? So I'm just addressing it in me. Like what part of that history has affected my life,
right,
and what I don't address, I'm going to bless, right?
right,
What I
right,
don't deal with inside of me, I'm going to keep going. And I
right,
don't want my kids to have to deal with those issues. So I would
right,
just challenge anybody who's watching this right now
right,
to, do a little bit of history and find out, there's a
right.
long line of abuse and dysfunction in our family. I want to know what it is so I can deal with it inside of me.
Yeah,
And that's
and so
important.
to that end, it's not all disaster. So
Right.
one of our relatives wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. This is a Revolutionary War. Daughters of the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of nobility in our family. This family of prominent attorneys have been involved in some precedent-setting legal cases. So you can, for
Right.
me, I take that swag with me. You know what I mean? So it's not all just my father was an alcoholic.
Right.
There's some things in the past that we can be proud of as well. And if you incorporate them, and I always call it like a swag in my step, right? If you can incorporate some of those things, and they're pretty, monumental in the founding of this country. Fighting in the Revolutionary War, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the Mayflower, all of that. There's some nobility there. And you can kind of cloak yourself in that, and it's not all like my dad was the foster kid that grew up in Weymouth. There's
Right.
more than that there.
There's more
Right,
to it.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's awesome. All right. Another great episode.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. See you
Love you, Dave.
guys.
I
Love
love
you.
that hat.
The Scally Cat from
It looks good.
Boston.
Wear that every day. I couldn't do that. I'd look like I don't know what I'd look like, but hey, listen, I want to next week I want to talk about Charlie and the MTA, that song. He'll never return. No, that song scared the crap out of me when I was a kid.
Mike,
I never
I
got on
don't
the
get
bus because of
you.
that.
My brother's afraid of whatever happened to Baby Jane.
I
What?
am. Well, let's talk about that. Our babysitter had a babysitter story again. She had me. I was 5. I was 5 years old, and she had me watch Betty Davis beat the stuff out of her sister and starve her to death. I was 5.
It's a dark comedy. It's a dark comedy.
Scared the living daylights out of me.
But you are, Blanche. You are in that chair. Like,
oh gosh, I was 5.
I send him memes all the time.
I know you do. I hate you. Love you, Dave.
Anyway, love you too. Carry on. Bye.